Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, Charting a New Course, How Shifting Our Approach to Safety Culture Can Help Us Tackle Serious Injuries and Fatalities, sponsored by Cority. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health magazine, and I will be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. We hope you all are safe and well amid the evolving COVID-19 pandemic. In a few minutes, we'll start the presentation, but first I want to go over some preliminary items. The views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we will conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the Send button. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we might not get to every question. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded along to today's speaker. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey that will appear on a separate screen. I will let you know more about that after the presentation. This webcast is archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. You may also receive a link in a post-event email. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Sean Baldry, a product marketing manager with Cority, who brings more than 15 years of experience in occupational safety and health as part of the construction, mining, and manufacturing industries. In addition, Sean is a Canadian registered safety professional. Sean, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Kevin, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you're calling in from. So I think it's fair to say that since we've all been rather consumed with everything COVID-19 over the past few months, many people may not have realized that this past April, the world celebrated a particularly grim anniversary. It was 10 years ago in April of 2010 that an explosion rocked BP's Deepwater Horizon oil platform operating in the Gulf of Mexico that instantly claimed the lives of 11 workers and resulted in arguably the largest oil spill in U.S. history. And yet, one of the aspects I still find intriguing about this event, even a decade later, is this, that on the morning of the disaster, senior officials at BP and Transocean, which was the contractor operating the rig, had arrived at the platform to celebrate a safety milestone. The site had operated for 7 consecutive years without a lost time injury, and yet, just 12 hours later, that same platform was now burning and falling into the sea, taking 11 people with it. And for me, this contradiction in safety success with Deepwater Horizon kind of alluded to a larger trend in industry, that while rates of reportable occupational injuries have been declining and have declined steadily in many nations over the past 2 decades, the rates of serious injuries and fatalities, or SIFs, have decreased at a much slower rate, in some cases remaining flat or even rising over that same period. And we've since discovered that part of the reason for this trend was that organizations and how organizations were approaching incident prevention was somewhat flawed. Many of us were taught that addressing lower order events at the base of the safety pyramid, by doing that we would address the same underlying causes that contribute to the more severe events at the peak. But in reality, we've discovered that only about 20% of those lower order events even have the potential to result in SIFs. So addressing the other 80% had virtually no effect on whether or not the SIF would eventually occur. So unsurprisingly, organizations who started to discover this started shifting their programs in ways that would enable them to better identify incidents with that SIF potential within their operations. But for me, there's a question that we need to ask, and that's, what about safety culture? What elements of safety culture need to be shifted as well to support SIF prevention? Are certain elements of safety culture more critical than others in determining SIF prevention success? And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. So what I'd like to do today is explore this idea of how safety culture influences SIF prevention success. And to do so, I thought we'd start by briefly reviewing what we know about SIFs and some of the key elements that we should be considering when we're building our SIF prevention programs. Afterward, I want to review a few key ideas about how we can shift our safety culture in ways that we can help support our SIF prevention efforts. So particularly, I want to talk about measuring success, learning from failure, and controlling bias in how we make decisions. And since Cority is a software company, we'll look at a few ways throughout the presentation where technology could help support these culture shifts to ensure that they're effective at arriving at the ultimate goal, which is the reduction of serious injuries and fatalities. So without further ado, let's get started and let's just talk a little bit about preventing SIFs and where we are today. So we know that we can't expect to reduce SIFs simply by focusing on addressing minor incidents at the base of the pyramid, as we talked about, simply because the factors that underlie the two incident types, those minor events and those major events, are fundamentally different. And as a result, much of an organization's ability to prevent SIFs is really dependent on its ability to identify those factors or precursors that give those events a higher potential to result in those serious and life-threatening consequences. And in fact, in a recent paper, the Campbell Institute suggested or defined SIF precursors as having three specific aspects. The first was that it involved a task or situation involving high risk. So working at heights or entering a confined space would invariably be those high-risk situations. The second would involve critical control measures, what we would often call life-saving measures, that are designed to protect workers from the risks of these high-risk activities are often missing, they're inadequate, or they're not followed. And finally, there's a condition that exists that if the work were allowed to continue with the absence or the ineffectiveness of those controls, then a serious and fatal injury would be much more likely. And certainly, while the identification of SIF precursors is a critical element in reducing, our potential for serious injuries and fatalities, there are other elements that businesses need to consider when we're formulating that comprehensive SIF prevention strategy. And I've listed a few here. They're certainly not comprehensive at all, but ones that I thought were particularly important. So the first, deals with management support. So like any initiative that we have in occupational health and safety, strong executive sponsorship is absolutely critical to ensure we have the appropriate resources to achieve our eventual SIF prevention goals. The second involves life-saving rules. So these are the rules that are often absent when we look at SIFs, but we need organizations to define what critical control measures are needed to be able to manage those common risks that employees encounter that in turn could increase their exposure to SIFs. The third involves training and education. All employees need to be trained in SIFs, what SIF precursors are, their life-saving rules, as well as the expectations and processes that are necessary for reporting events to enable the organization to identify those incidents with SIF potential with greater expediency. And finally, I would argue that metrics and data analysis are particularly important. This is where organizations need to define how they will collect and analyze SIF-related data to enable them to measure the effectiveness of their SIF prevention efforts, and really to determine how data will help guide their decision-making in determining priorities or where to allocate resources. But again, I keep coming back to this idea of what effect does an organization's safety culture have in its ability to achieve this SIF prevention strategy or their ultimate goals in reducing these serious and fatal events. And when I was thinking about this, three specific questions came to mind. The first concerned reporting. We know that reporting is key to identifying SIF precursors, but what do you do when your workers won't report? What changes do we have to make within our culture to enable reporting to be more fluid and more accessible? The second involved this idea of learning from mistakes. We know that learning from mistakes is a key to reducing SIFs, but how open is your culture to exploring and critically analyzing its failures? A lot of organizations aren't really open to that. And finally, it really concerns how we make decisions. Any risk in a SIF prevention strategy, or there is a risk, I should say, within a SIF prevention strategy in that we end up spending our time and money on things that don't really have an impact on SIFs. So how well are we using our data to ensure that we're making the right decisions and we're overcoming any sort of inherent bias that we have within our organization or just culturally? So I want to spend a little bit of time on exploring and answering these three questions, and I thought the first thing that we could do is we could explore this idea of reporting. But before we do so, let's return to the story of Deepwater Horizon for a minute. Now, what many people don't realize is that it was discovered during the investigation of the disaster that Transocean had conducted an anonymous survey with the rig workers a month prior to the event. And the survey found that roughly 50% of the employees that were included in the survey were reluctant to raise safety concerns to management out of their fear of reprisal. So in effect, their fear of being blamed for adverse events was a strong incentive not to report. In fact, it was stronger than the fear of actually being harmed by whatever they were keeping under their belts. And we've said before that a critical step in SIF prevention involves the prompt identification of incidents with SIF potential. But our ability to detect SIF potential is contingent upon the willingness of our employees to report events when they occur. And the way that an organization responds to bad news can greatly influence whether workers are willing to bring those issues forward in the first place. Organizations that respond to negative news with anger, frustration, ridicule, or blame all but assure themselves that those workers will probably think twice about bringing that issue up the next time around. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how can organizations create that reporting culture that we know is necessary for SIF prevention? And I'm going to offer two ideas. The first involves changing the way that we measure safety success, and the second involves how we make reporting easier for the frontline individual. So first off, I think we need to acknowledge that most organizations measure safety success by the absence of incidents or the absence of failure. Essentially for them, safety success happens when nothing happens. When we don't have events, that's a good day. And we know that businesses place enormous emphasis on their injury frequency rates as a gauge of how well their safety program is performing. And in case, and this was my personal experience, performance incentives for managers and individuals within the organization are often even tied to this rate. So there's a huge emphasis, whether implicit or implied, that having events is a bad thing. So, and I put this graphic on the left-hand side of the screen to really ask a question to everyone is, how many of you have a sign like this in your workplace? And really to question yourself and ask, what message is that really sending? Is it really sending the right message, or is it sending a hidden message that we might not be aware of? So in an environment where there's so much emphasis placed on keeping rates low, we need to ask ourselves, why would anyone volunteer to be the person to bring up the issue that's going to negatively impact that number? And certainly if management responds negatively when those events in fact are reported, we only make the incentive to not report that much stronger. Oh, sorry about that. So I think a question that we need to ask ourselves is, but what if we could find a way to measure safety success differently in a way that would encourage reporting? So I want to give you tell you a little story or a little example I heard recently that I thought hit this mark beautifully. So imagine that you're driving to the airport. And if you arrive at the airport without getting into a crash, were you safe? Now, if we measure safety success by the absence of incidents, then we'd probably say yes. But we all know that just because I didn't crash doesn't mean I was safe. It doesn't show whether I was actively controlling all the risks while driving in such a way that I've reduced my potential for an incident. In fact, it doesn't tell me whether I was safe while I was driving. But if I instead decided to measure my capacity to drive safely, I would probably pay attention to a few different metrics. In that case, I might consider, was I driving at a speed that was correct for the road conditions? Did I ensure that my tires had the appropriate tread? Were my light signals and gauges functioning properly? Did I give myself enough time to get to the airport without rushing? Was I rested and not overly fatigued? And by redefining how we measure safety in this way, we not only shift our attention to managing elements that have a direct impact on our potential to have that negative event, but we also shift our perspective of the incident from something that's negative to be avoided and hidden at all cost to something from which we can learn. And that's really the key point here. And certainly by selecting the right indicators to measure this capacity to manage risk, we're more able to directly affect the things that allow SIFs to occur, those SIF those SIF precursors. And in this sense, I might select indicators that measure the percent of training completed relative to the task, that high-risk task that I'm engaged in. I might measure the percentage or the number of task observations completed that ensures that people are following the things that they need to. I might look at proactive equipment inspections to make sure the equipment is of a condition that enables that job to be done safely, or I even might measure the days to close corrective actions. Now, all of these indicators are directly influenceable, and they help us to identify gaps in our program capacity that could create those conditions for those SIF precursors to occur. And certainly, by leveraging technology, we have an opportunity to not only simplify our data collection, by allowing frontline employees to, submit observations, their inspections, their tasks, their updates directly from the field using a mobile device so they can update that information in real time. But we also increase our visibility of our data. And that enables us to, more quickly detect when indicators are trending in the wrong direction, and then assign and track completion of those actions created to address that negative trend. So there's certainly an opportunity there that we can really leverage technology for an immediate benefit. And lastly, and before we move on to the next point, we talked earlier about creating, certainly how do we make changes to the way that we measure success to create that reporting culture. But the other side of reporting is, in order to build that strong reporting culture, we need to make reporting as easy as possible. Even in environments where workers don't fear reporting adverse outcomes, processes that make reporting too difficult or overly administrative will reduce the chance that frontline workers will share data that is vital for SIF prevention efforts. And for us at Cority, where we're operating in the software space, we've seen an absolute explosion, both internally and within the industry at large, a huge explosion in mobile EHS applications, where organizations can leverage digital mobile tools to simplify their event reporting process. So in this case, when an event occurs, a worker would be able to open an app on their device, record the relevant data, in some cases attach photos, or even identify SIF precursors or conduct a SIF assessment, depending on how the solution is configured, which the business can later use to assess that incident's relative priority and what they need to do about it next. And certainly by leveraging some of the other features within the solution, such as automated notifications that can be configured on the back end, we also improve our ability to share those lessons, to share that information quickly across the business, and that certainly helps facilitate organizational learning, which again can be input into our SIF prevention efforts for a lot of benefit. So, beyond reporting or beyond building that reporting culture, organizations also need to consider how they approach learning from failure, and that's what I want to talk about next. So one of the most interesting books I've read recently is called Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed, and I've given you a view of the book cover on the left. So the book offers a very interesting story about the B-17, which is pictured on the right. Now, the B-17 was an aircraft that was used heavily by the US Army to conduct strategic bombing campaigns over Germany in World War II. And in the book recounts a story where during the 1940s, the B-17 was involved in a series of seemingly inexplicable runway accidents. And at first, the Army was convinced that pilots were simply lacking situational awareness when landing, so they were focusing a lot of their efforts on improving pilot training, I should say, as a means to reduce incidents. But when the incidents failed to decrease, the Army turned to a psychologist to try to study the crashes and provide recommendations on how these events could be avoided. And what they found was that these crashes had less to do with pilot error and more to do with system design. So specifically, they found that the levers that controlled the aircraft's landing gear were not only the exact shape of the levers that controlled the wing flaps, but they were also positioned side by side on the instrumentation panel in the cockpit. And the design wasn't necessarily a problem when the pilots were flying in ideal conditions, but when they were attempting to make a difficult landing or a landing under pressure, the pilots were inadvertently pulling the wrong lever. So instead of retracting the wing flaps to reduce airspeed on approach, they were actually retracting the wheels and causing the plane to belly flop on the runway, and obviously the consequences that are associated with that. And as a result of the investigation, the US Army modified the two control levers so they could look differently And in doing so, virtually the accident has disappeared overnight. So you're probably asking yourselves, what does this have to do with SIFs? I think what we need to acknowledge is that all humans, all of us, have an inherent bias when we look at error. Specifically, we tend to overestimate personality factors and we underestimate situational factors to try to explain another person's observed behavior. So in other words, we focus more on why a person involved in an event didn't act the way that they were supposed to, and we pay much less attention to the circumstances that existed that may have influenced why that person acted that way in the first place. And certainly earlier, when we mentioned that SIF precursors involved highly hazardous situations where management controls are either absent, ineffective, or not complied with, I'd argue that many companies, when they investigate SIF precursors, or they investigate these serious events, they tend to focus more on whether or not the worker complied with the controls and less about whether the controls were effective in the first place. And I say this because in the vast majority of cases, and this is borne out in a lot of research studies, that when workers commit errors, they're generally unintentional. And they often result in how a system or process is designed, which creates an error trap. So it creates this unfavorable condition that increases the probability of that error in that particular situation, much like pilots pulling the wrong lever when they're attempting to make a high-stress landing. It's just, they lose focus, and just inadvertently hit the wrong lever. Those error traps, in a lot of cases, create the majority of our incidents. But I think when we look at work, we need to acknowledge that workers live at that sharp end of the stick, so in closest proximity to the hazard. And though they live at that sharpest end, they generally exert the least amount of power in defining how that work should be performed. So in other words, the individuals with the most knowledge of how the work should be performed safely are often have the least say in how those risks ought to be controlled. And I think that's because there's often a disconnect between how we imagine work is done and how work is actually done. And unless we as organizations go to the actual people that do the work and ask them how the work needs to be done certainly in the context of how they know it needs to be done, what happens is we end up recommending controls that look great on paper, but which don't really address risk, or which create those error traps that in effect make serious events and fatalities much more likely. And I think this is where learning teams come in. A learning team is simply a facilitated conversation between those that do the work and those that design the work to enable them to share intelligence that helps the organization identify where errors can occur in a system, and then identify the measures to improve the system to prevent those errors. Together, it's the workers and the designers collaborating to design those management controls that are appropriate to the nature of the hazards, but which do not create those error traps that make SIFs more likely. But what's most important, and I guess what makes learning teams much more effective, is that it creates that blame-free environment that helps businesses explore those failures and really enable them to drive down to the real root causes of problems. In a lot of cases, that really frank and open and transparent discussion between those that do the work and those that design the work can't really happen because there's this belief that we can't talk about failures either individually because we fear how people will perceive us if we admit to problems, or the organization just is not structured in a way that does this. But in a lot of organizations that have adopted learning cultures or learning teams, it's been really effective at reducing SIF precursors more sustainably. And certainly we're back to this idea of technology and how, a good question to ask ourselves is, how can technology support the development of a learning culture? As mentioned, learning teams provide that environment where all workplace parties can dive deep into SIF potential events to identify those precursors and the root causes that allow those precursors to exist. And in a lot of cases, advanced root cause analysis solutions available through software provides this process. It allows that process to occur in a much more streamlined and effective fashion. And what I've done here on the screen is just give you an example, a workflow of sorts, to help show how technology could assist not only in identifying root causes, but it could assist the conversations that learning teams are having to enable them to really arrive more quickly at those problems that they're facing, to be able to resolve them in a more sustainable way, and then in doing so, enable them to really build in the improvements that are necessary to be able to resolve serious incidents of fatalities with a lot more speed and effectiveness. So on the left-hand side of the screen, this workflow could simply start with an individual who reports a SIF potential event using a tablet or a mobile device of sorts. And that would trigger a workflow within a selected solution, root cause analysis solution, to enable the organization to really drill down and again, begin to piece through and identify what are the precursors, what are the causal factors that are contributing to that event, and in effect, identify those root causes. From that point, that information, that intel, can be utilized by that learning team to really review those that SIF-related data and try to recommend system designs, design changes that encourage better workflows and certainly remove those possibilities that errors could occur within that system that could trigger those precursors and those serious events and fatalities. The outputs of that process, it could be specific actions that are assigned to a worker, which again, if we're leveraging mobile solutions, it enables the worker, us to talk in real time to that worker, the worker to understand what they need to do, and then to provide those updates in real time. So we're constantly, from an organizational level, looking at that information and being able to gauge where our priorities sit and where do we have to allocate our resources and direct our attention. And the other huge benefit is it enables us to share learnings across the organization. So if there's a particular learning that we find at a particular area of our business or location, and we want to share it more broadly to see that success replicated, we can do so by leveraging technology pretty easily. And finally, at the back end, much of the business intelligence offerings that are within these solutions certainly enable organizations to monitor their data and really to identify, are there any systemic trends that we're seeing that we need to address more broadly with more broad organizational initiatives. But really the key here is that information, again, feeds back into that iterative process with the learning team. So we're constantly curating more information, and we're constantly using that information to really guide what we think we should be doing. So the last idea that I'd like to explore today involves how organizations should leverage their collected data to ensure that decisions that guide their SIF prevention strategies are based on evidence, so we can minimize the chances that we waste our time and our resources on issues that have little effect on SIF potential. And what I thought was interesting is a few years ago, the Campbell Institute released a white paper on SIF prevention, and within the white paper, they cited 3 additional indicators of serious injuries and fatalities. And the first involved the idea of normalization of deviation or normalization of deviance. You might have come across this idea in a lot of reports on highly catastrophic events, over the last 20 or 30 years. But normalization of deviation refers to situations in which deviating from accepted standards becomes so common that it becomes tacitly accepted, that we start accepting deviating from the rules so much that it becomes commonplace, and we don't even think of it as a deviation anymore. The second issue involves uncalibrated risk perceptions or risk tolerance. So this really refers to the aspect of different workers approaching situations involving risk differently due to their lack of information, training, or experience that prevents us from driving a consistent approach. So we approach risk differently, and this creates those conditions for SIFs to occur. And what I found particularly interesting was this idea of decisions not being grounded in empirical data. And this factor reflects the risk of organizations making safety decisions that weren't based on objective data. And this really increased the chances that cognitive bias would influence how we approach SIF prevention efforts. And it's really this last idea that I'd like to discuss over the final few minutes of the presentation. So, earlier in the presentation, we mentioned that how we view issues and how we make decisions are often influenced by, inherent human bias. And, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to argue that, excuse me, there's 3 specific biases that tend to significantly influence how organizations make decisions for EHS in particular, which can have an impact on our SIF prevention efforts. And the first involves recency bias. Now, this is the tendency to remember or place greater importance on events that have occurred most recently. So, as a result, we all tend to focus on whatever, quote, memorable event happened last. But we all know that unfortunately the most recent or memorable event is not always the one most deserving of our effort or action, and again, may not necessarily address the most critical SIF potential. The second bias involves confirmation bias. This is the tendency for us to search for, to interpret, to focus on, to favor information in ways that confirm our own ideas, our own preconceptions of what's going on. Now, we all have beliefs of what's going on in our workplace to drive incidents, but this bias, if it's left uncontrolled, can result in us selectively filtering data to confirm patterns that don't really exist. And therefore, it results in potentially businesses focusing on areas with the idea that it will address the underlying causes of SIFs when it really doesn't. And the last bias that I wanted to talk about was really this idea of present bias. So this is the tendency of people to give stronger weight to shorter-term payoffs. And if you think about it, in many performance-based cultures that many of our organizations operate within, there is a tendency to reward progress, right? And that certainly can influence the actions that we take. I often wonder if that's possibly one of the reasons that many employers jump to disciplining workers when events happen, as opposed to really trying to uncover what's really going on under the surface, because that disciplinary action is immediate and it is tangible. But again, unfortunately, these decisions may not necessarily address SIF potential in a sustainable and meaningful way. So what this really means is that to reduce SIF potential, businesses need to improve their ability to efficiently collect, aggregate, analyze, and transform their data into meaningful insights that will help guide their evidence-based decision-making so they can control their biases and ensure that they're spending their time and money on the things that actually reduce SIF potential. Yet, what's interesting, one of the challenges that organizations face is that they lack scalable capacity to transform their collected data into insights. And in large part, that's due to just the data volume and the velocity of data that's being collected in organizations now. Just to give you some perspective on this, there was a figure announced some time ago that stated that that there was about 50 or I think it was 50 billion gigabytes, I'm sorry, 50 billion gigabytes of data was collected through the course of recorded human history until about 2003. And by 2011, we were collecting that much data every 2 years. And 2 years after that, around 2013, I believe, we were collecting that amount of data every 10 minutes. And there's estimates now that by the end of 2020, we could be exceeding 40,000 exabytes of data by the end of the year. So if you don't know what an exabyte of data is, think of a number with 18 zeros behind it. That's an exabyte. So a massive amount of data that we're collecting, and that data is coming in faster than ever before. But really where companies are challenged is that we lack the computational power, the human computational power, to be able to transform this data into meaningful insights fast enough to be able to guide our rapid decision making. We just can't get through that amount of data, or the amount of data that we actually use in our analyses is minimal for what we really should be looking at to really guide our decisions and control the biases that we face. And as a final point, this is why the ability to leverage data analytics engines and software is so important for businesses, both in just general EHSQ scenarios, but certainly when we focus on reducing serious injuries and fatalities. You know, since many businesses struggle to synthesize their data analysis approaches are rather descriptive in nature. And by descriptive, I mean that it's mostly focused on creating those simple comparisons, like comparing rates over time or presenting single data sets graphically. And as we can imagine, there's only so much we can do with that information. But when we advance our technology and we look at what's offered in technology and software today, we open up opportunities to shift from a descriptive to a more predictive approach to data analysis, where we take all of our data, both EHS and non-EHS data, and we're able to feed it into machine learning algorithms that help us create a prediction of what events are most likely to occur in the future. And really in this manner, organizations would be able to leverage their SIF data to not only really understand what types of SIF events or what types of events are most likely to occur, but also what SIF precursors are most likely to influence those events, and thereby allow the organizations to really mobilize their resources to address those issues in a more targeted way. And certainly in doing so, we counteract our biases, so we aren't making safety decisions that sound good, but aren't really founded on empirical evidence. And what I've done is just, again, provided a graphic to help explain how a data analytics engine would really work. And I'll start, the flow starts from the left and moves to the right, but really what we do is we start the process where all of our data sources are identified and collected and directed toward a single storage location, normally through an API or some other system integration. And you know, certainly before the data is transmitted, it goes through a cleansing process to ensure that, you know, we have only good data that's feeding into our models, and ensuring that you know, it improves and sustains the value of the insights that we draw from it. This entire process of data transformation and unification helps create those structured data sets that we need for modeling, for analytical modeling. And from there, those data sets are fed into the analytical models, and we use machine learning algorithms and we use natural language processing algorithms to detect those patterns and to generate those insights. And then we're able to either warehouse those insights for future access or future manipulation, or at the same time transmit those to the end user in any selected device that they might want, which is going to further influence their decision-making and action. So really, if we want to ensure that we're focusing our resources on the areas that will have the greatest benefit for SIF prevention, we really need to start thinking about adopting solutions that enable us to really optimize the full value of our data, and that really enables businesses to be much more efficient at transforming, you know, those ones and zeros into really meaningful insights that are really going to tell us where we should be focusing our efforts. So that's in a sense everything that I wanted to speak to you about today. I certainly thank everyone for their time. Just a few things to recap some of the main points that we talked about today. The first is, you know, we know now through a lot of a trial and error, but through a lot of studies, you know, since the time of Deepwater Horizon, that what hurts people isn't the same as what kills people, unfortunately. And as a result, if we want to reduce our SIFs, we need to focus our attention on identifying the incidents with the greatest SIF potential, and really to dig into how we can address those precursors that influence those events. You know, and certainly there's an element of safety culture that comes into that. And we talked about three things. You know, identifying SIF potential requires that strong reporting culture. And organizations, you know, really should be considering how they can change how they measure or define safety success to remove that fear of reporting that might exist, but also looking for the ways that they can make reporting easier. And certainly there's a lot that software can offer to assist in that regard. You know, we have to understand that most errors are unintentional. So we need to avoid jumping to the conclusion when we do investigations of SIFs that the issue was worker behavior, and therefore changing worker behavior alone is going to allow us to arrive at the desired end goal. We need to recognize how system design can create those error traps, and really we can leverage learning teams as a way of promoting that organizational learning to really understand and learn from our failures in a very profound and meaningful way. And, and certainly, if we can't control our biases, we risk making decisions that waste our time and our resources and really do nothing to address SIF potential. And as we explained over the last few minutes, software solutions do offer a lot of huge analytical capabilities that can help create those quick insights that will ensure your SIF prevention efforts are focused on the right things. So again, this really brings me to the end of my presentation. I wanted to thank NSC for the opportunity to speak to you, and I will hand the floor back over to Kevin for any questions that anybody might have.
Excellent. Great job, Sean. We thank you for your insights and expertise. Before we do start the Q&A, just want to remind everyone of the evaluation survey that we'll be asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this presentation. Your input is important because it'll help us improve future webcasts, and we appreciate you taking that extra time. If you hadn't heard at the top of the presentation, if you do want to ask a question, you simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You then type your question and click the send button. So with that, now let's get to some questions for Sean. First one, Sean, since many companies include lagging indicators on annual shareholder reports and similar communications, leaders are often reluctant to get rid of them in place of more leading indicators. How would you suggest we shift mindsets of leadership to abandon lagging indicators?
Thanks, Kevin. That's a very good question. And I guess I'll caveat what I'm going to say by saying, hopefully I didn't misstate myself. I don't believe that we need to abandon lagging indicators. There is value that lagging indicators can bring because they do give us a gauge on how, whether we've selected the right leading indicators. So there is a balance between lagging and leading indicators. I think that there's value in both. But I think what we're really talking about is how do we shift the focus away from relying on lagging indicators as that key focal point of success, and really shifting to others. And really, I think it starts with educating our senior leaders on some of the loopholes or some of the drawbacks that lagging indicators can have. And in a sense, I think, in my experience, lagging indicators tend to be used more often to measure success because they're simple to measure. So I think what it gets to is really try to engage in a really fruitful discussion with all the key stakeholders within your organization. So that includes leaders, but that includes, employee representatives. If you're in a unionized environment, it could be your union leadership, your both operational and your EHSQ experts, and really try to, discuss where do we want to go? What is the end goal that we have in terms of, certainly SIF prevention, but also how would we be able to measure success in different ways, right? And really try to explore what are the loopholes or what are the constraints of using lagging indicators to allow us to arrive at that end goal. And I think what it involves, it's a very iterative process. I think it involves a little bit of trial and error. I think it's about coming up with some good measures and showing and building and showing the organization how those measures actually lead to the outcomes that we're looking for. And I think eventually over time, you'll get organizations shifting away from the importance of lagging indicators to more leading indicators. But I'm not suggesting it's a simple endeavor. If it was, everybody would be doing it. But I think it's really, you have to start with that engagement, but of all those stakeholders around, what are we really trying to achieve? And what are the right indicators that we can measure to really show incremental steps to where we want to go?
Next question for you. What is a recommended software or technology setup that can be adopted in the way mentioned here?
Oh, that's another interesting question. So the recommended software setup, I think what you would want to do. So, when you're selecting software solutions, the key really to, I'll break it up into a couple points. So if we're looking for information or means to enable frontline employees to be more engaged in this process of building the culture that we want, that's necessary for SIF prevention, I think you have to look at providing software solutions and technologies that meet the worker where they are. So meaning that tools that the worker can use, like any other tool that they have in their natural environment, that enables that free flow of information. And this is really where mobile solutions come in. So if we can provide that information that they can regularly and easily give feedback, they can also access information that they need to do their jobs better. That's going to be that wheel, that gear that's going to ensure that we're getting that consistent, reliable data coming into the system. The other side of the coin that you have to look at is looking for solutions that have those features that can evaluate the quality of the data that you're getting. So this ensures that whatever models that we're creating out of the software solutions that we're using, that they're accurate as possible. So it means that we need to filter the garbage, quote unquote, out of our data to make sure that it's accurate as possible, and make sure that we have complete records. So really look for solutions that do that. I know I'll speak for Cority. At Cority, we have a tool called our data quality score, which enables us to consistently look at the accuracy and the timeliness of records that are coming in, to ensure that we have greater reliability on the insights that we have. So if we're seeing records coming in that are only half completed, then they obviously will provide less accurate insights than records that are 100% completed. So really look for solutions that enable you to really filter through and ensure the accuracy and the validity of your data. But then also look for solutions that can integrate with other ERP solutions, other CRM solutions, other things that you're using within your business to pull data together. A part of the challenge with having multiple systems is they don't talk to each other, or it's very difficult to talk to each other. So having a unified platform is certainly important, both within EHSQ. So occupational health information, hygiene information, safety, environmental information, it can certainly talk to each other because we know of the connections, but also that we're able to bring in HR data, we're able to bring in operational data, maintenance data that can help inform what are some of the conditions in which SIFs can occur, and that's really going to create a more broader degree of insights that we have, and that's really going to get you to a lot of good information that's really going to guide your SIF prevention efforts.
Next question, are behavioral-based programs effective in cultural or behavioral change?
I would say yes. I think with behavioral-based problems or behavioral-based safety, the intention is always good. So the intention, and I'm speaking for myself here, the intention is good because we need to recognize that, as we all know, there's system elements and there are behavioral elements to any incident. So we certainly can't look too far on the system side with it, to the extent where we're not considering the behavioral elements, but we also have to recognize that we can't look too far on the behavioral side as well. So I think that there are certainly there's a place for behavioral-based safety. I would caution to say, to ensure that we understand the limitations of our behavioral-based safety programs and ensure that it's not creating conditions that stifle reporting, that stifle interactions, because there's a pervasive belief within your organizational culture that behavioral-based safety is all about finding people doing things wrong, right? So I think there's definitely a place for it within SIF prevention. It's just finding where that place is and making sure that it's balanced. There's a balanced approach, that we're considering all variables when it comes to looking at failure, as opposed to the tendency to point our finger at the worker as a first resort, and unfortunately a lot of investigations stop there.
Who does the learning team consist of? Is that like a committee in the company, or is it data combined with Cority to see what other companies are doing?
Oh, so a learning team can exist outside of any software solution that anybody would like to use. So a learning team is just a collection of individuals. So there's really no rhyme or there's no rhyme or reason for this learning team. What I would suggest, if you're starting with a learning team, is again, make sure that your focus, I would say start small. So perhaps identify a particular problem or a particular scenario that that's causing you a concern or something that you'd want to dive into. And instead of relying on your EHSQ professionals, and they'll certainly have a seat at the table, really what we're trying to do is have that blame-free environment where we can kind of throw everything on the table and we can involve the workers that actually do the job and the people that have responsibility of designing how the job should be done. So those ideal conditions in which the work is done, and really have a really frank discussion of, here's how we design the job. Here's how the organization believes the job needs to be done to manage risk effectively and reduce the potential for serious injuries and fatalities, and then provide that opportunity for those employees to really, come out and say, but you don't understand, this is how we have to do the work. And what that enables those people to do is really arrive at, the right solutions that are going to ensure that that we can eliminate those SIF precursors. That it's not just we set rules that can't be followed, but we set the right rules that we know that we can do consistently, and in doing so, remove those precursors. So I think, think about, there's a lot of frontline worker involvement. I would try to keep out anybody that could politicize that discussion. So I would probably avoid senior leaders that might encourage people to want to not necessarily freely share their ideas, and really have that conversation. And really, what I was mentioning with software is software is just a way that you can use your tools. Or use tools to give that learning team more data to arrive at better conclusions, better decisions, right? So how can we, again, leverage all the data that we collect on a daily basis to really ensure that we're looking at data, we're challenging our assumptions, we're challenging our biases, and we're really arriving at where we need to be so we can have the most effect on injuries.
Does this system help supervisors conduct good incident root cause and corrective actions?
If you're referring to a software solution, I would say absolutely. There's a number of software solutions out there that have audit and inspection modules built right into them. Again, that can be leveraged either through a desktop application or a mobile application, and that's some of the things that that organizations really find extremely beneficial is the fact that I can create inspections. And I can assign those inspections to anybody that has a mobile device, and they can go out and complete those in real time. And I essentially eliminate the administrative burden of having to take that paper copy and then type it into another spreadsheet to be able to track the outcomes. That's all done seamlessly through the interconnections that are done in the solution. So it drastically improves not only the supervisor's day, it removes some of those what they would call non-value added activities to enable the supervisor to really get to the things that really matter. But it also means that our visibility to the data is almost instantaneous, because that lag time between when we get the report and when it's put into a format that can be shared is if not eliminated, then really, really reduced. So I think these solutions can certainly help. In referring to some of the things that we had talked about with changes with culture, all cultural changes are definitely going to have a benefit, I think, with how supervisors do their job, specifically because culture for me means that we have a degree of openness, and it means that everybody has a goal, and we're all directed toward that same goal. And I think if we can organize our organizations around cultures that everybody can mobilize around, it's going to be a benefit to all workplace parties.
In your experience, what type of employee safety goals go against a safety culture?
That go against the safety culture, again, I think for me it would focus on those hard lagging indicators. So anywhere where like goals, and I should say indicators in and of themselves, I don't think are bad. It's how those indicators influence how people interpret their importance and interpret how they do their day-to-day jobs. There's nothing wrong with, I guess conceptually, there's nothing wrong with incident rate. What we find what's wrong with incident rate is how it encourages people to see and interact with the workers at the front line. So again, I'll refer back to the points that I made earlier in the presentation. If looking at the incident rate, I perceive anything that increases incidents as something bad, and that in turn, for me, if I was a frontline supervisor, it means that I'm going to feel heat from my manager. That's going to influence how I approach things, and that might influence how I approach individuals. In my experience, I've seen, unfortunately, in a lot of cases where the importance of managing numbers, in some cases, superseded just general regard for the individual that was involved in the event. So, an individual is involved in an event, and for me, the first thing that we should be doing as organizational leaders is ensuring that person has immediate medical attention, and that we ensure that they're okay. And if that empathy is lost because we're more worried about managing numbers, then that's definitely going to have an impact on how workers perceive the organization caring for them, and that's in turn going to influence their openness to share ideas. It's going to influence their desire to report, and it's certainly going to influence their ability to engage and actively participate in safety. And we know that organizations in which only half the organization is working toward a goal aren't going to be very successful. So I think, again, is really looking at those points that we had mentioned today. How we're managing safety or measuring it. I would start there as probably a first point and say, how is that inadvertently changing attitudes or influencing attitudes in a way that we don't want?
Next question concerns small companies. It says, with an example of a construction company with 50 employees, that might not have much risk data in a year. They may just have a few SIFs from day to day. So then how can they benefit from industry group big databases?
It's a great point. And I would say that the way that I would answer that is, the person that raised the question is absolutely correct. Like there's this interesting dynamic, right? That if we're measuring safety success by lagging indicators, and we're getting better at reducing incidents, then that's great. But what we're doing is we're reducing our data pool, right? So whether or not you just fundamentally disagree with measuring incidents or the effect of it, or you're one of those leading organizations that's either getting better at safety, like injury reduction, or you just don't create enough of these data points to really understand where you are, that's certainly going to make it more challenging to really understand where SIF potential exists. But it's also going to really make it challenging to make that business case for software investment. So again, the way that I would approach that is I would say that creates a perfect condition that you should be looking for those leading indicators, right? So looking for those indicators that enable you to really try to understand, okay, if we're not getting events, what are some of the things that we can directly influence that we could probably know that if we're not doing them, we increase the risk of those events happening, right? And those could be proactive inspections, they could be observations, they could be BBS task observations, they could be any of a number of things that are worthwhile to measure in safety. And I think in doing so, you're going to build that data set, and then maybe at that point, it becomes a little bit more fruitful to look at software and how that could be used to help your SIF prevention efforts.
Well, thank you, Sean. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but all today's unanswered questions will be forwarded on to our speaker. Once again, we hope you take the time to fill out the evaluation survey to offer us your feedback. It will be coming in a separate window, and we do appreciate you taking that extra time to tell us what you think. With that, we'll end today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank Sean Baldry, everyone at Cority, and all of you who listened in. Thanks, and have a great day.